So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the idea of network performance. So when we say network performance, what we really mean is, well, how well does a network perform when I'm trying to send data across it? So do I have to wait for a long time, or does it go through really quickly? So one of the key ideas here is bandwidth, which we're going to explore quite a lot in this lesson because it's one of those terms, although quite a simple term in terms of what it is, a lot of people are ingrained to think that speed and bandwidth are the same thing, and we need to try and uncouple that a little bit. So before we get into that, let's consider a bit of recap of the previous lesson. So what hardware do we use in a wide area network? Well, in a wide area network, we need to be able to connect local area networks together. Okay, so remember, a wide area network can be thought of as a load of local area networks all connected together. And the way we connect to local area networks to other local area networks is through a device called a router. Now at home, you will have a router which will connect you to the internet. Now remember, the internet is a giant wide area network, ergo you are using your router to connect to a WAN. And your home network is also a LAN as well. So what hardware do you use in a LAN? Well, when we're talking about this, we're really talking about things like a school or a business or things like that. And the hardware here we're looking at is a switch. Now we will also use a router if we're connecting that local area network to a wide area network, but what we're really focusing in here is how do the computers inside the network connect together, okay? And that's going to be through a switch. So how many routers do you think a school has and why? Now, a lot of people will say, well, you know, we might have multiple routers, you know, all connected together. Well, how many local area networks do we have in a school? So the number is going to be very small. It'll be one, maybe two at best. It's not going to be many because we only have one connection to the internet, and that's going to be done through the router, obviously. So routers in a network are normally very low numbered, but we might have many switches depending on how many rooms of computers we are connecting together. So we're going to be looking at a number of factors which impact the performance. So we're looking at bandwidth, number of users, the transmission media, the error rate and latency. So we're going to be exploring these ideas, but bandwidth is one of the most important ones because all the others kind of link into it. So bandwidth describes the amount of data that can be sent and received over a network at a given time, and we measure it using bit rates, number of bits per second. Now it's a little bit weird, we don't say bytes per second, we say bits per second. So remember, a bit is a single 1 and 0, okay, and a byte is made up of 8 bits. So if you want kilobytes per second, you have to divide these numbers by 8. Anyway, the number of bits per second are normally grouped together in kilobits, megabits and gigabits. Okay, so kilobits is how the olden days, like dial-up, we used to measure speed. So I remember I used to connect using 56 kilobits per second, and it was amazing back in the day. Yeah, I'm showing my age now. Megabits is what you'll probably get your home broadband in. So you might have, I don't know, 5 megabits, 7 megabits, 20 megabits, 70, depending on whatever broadband deal you have. And then gigabits, this tends to be used in local area networks. You might have a gigabit connection between a computer and a switch, a 10 gigabit connection maybe between switches and routers. So these are normally what we use for wired connections, okay? So the bigger the bits per second, the more data can be sent and received at a single time. However, it's not how fast that data can travel. Okay, so the speed of data, how fast a single bit will travel over your network, is always going to be the same. You can't really control that speed, but you can control how much you send at once. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be showing you a very simple experiment to kind of demonstrate the idea of bandwidth. Now, a lot of people, when they think of bandwidth, they think of speed. Now, although we kind of see it at the end as speed, it's not really speed, okay? Because a single packet will travel through a network at roughly the same speed, regardless of bandwidth. However, bandwidth really is a measure of how much data I can send at a given moment, or how many megabits I can send over a network in a single second, megabits per second. So let's see the experiment. Now here I've got a jug of red dyed water. This is representing data I want to send or receive, should I say, from a website. Let's say Netflix. So let's say I'm downloading a film of Netflix. So films are quite big files, so there's going to be quite a lot of data I need to receive. Now, if at home you had a low bandwidth, you're going to have something that kind of represents like this. Okay, so only a little bit of data can travel to your computer at a given time. Okay, small amount of data. If I have a kind of a medium bandwidth, okay, more data can travel to your computer at once, and obviously if I have a large bandwidth, more can travel at once. So let's actually see this in action. So what I'm going to do is going to place that over there. So this is my low bandwidth. I'm going to use this kind of hold cup as a funnel. So I'm going to place that on top of there, and I'm going to put the data in. So here I've requested the movie off Netflix, and we're now waiting. Okay, so if you've got a low bandwidth at home, so maybe a really low bandwidth, you're in a bad signal area, or what happens to be, you're going to be waiting for the data for a long time. So I don't know if you can see this very clearly in the video, but the data is actually going through. So we are getting the data, but all waiting a long time. So the water is trickling through that hole very slowly because I have a very low bandwidth. So that's going to take a long time to come through. So at the other end, at your end, you're going to be experiencing buffering. So you can be waiting to film. You might be watching a little bit, it suddenly stops, a little circle starts to spin, and you're just having to wait for the file. Okay, so this is what happens when you have a low bandwidth. Now, that's going to take a while. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quit that one without trying to spill too much. There we go. I'm losing a lot of liquid this way. And now let's see the same thing with a medium style bandwidth. Okay, so here I've got a slightly larger hole. So I'm going to place that on that. And again, same amount of data. Let's see the difference in speed now. Now, although the water is still traveling at the same speed, you can't really control that because of gravity and all that kind of stuff. The actual amount of water going through at a single time, the flow, the bandwidth, is going to be much higher. So let's actually see that. So as you can see, same amount of data, so the same film, let's say, but that's gone through a lot faster. Okay, so the higher bandwidth we have, the faster we get the data, not because the data itself is going faster, but I'm getting more of it at once. Okay, now that is the medium one, and that was quite quick. The last one I'm going to show is the large one, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about a large bandwidth. So imagine you have a really great broadband deal, you've got a high bandwidth. Let's see the difference. So here's my file, and it's going through really quickly, but it's not exceptionally faster. And the reason for that is because a lot of this bandwidth is going to be wasted, because we don't really need a massive bandwidth if we're just watching a film. So the amount of bandwidth you require is dependent on what you're using it for. If you have a massive load of bandwidth and you don't really use it, it's not utilized fully, then it's just going to be wasted. Okay, so there is this kind of trade-off between how much bandwidth you need and how much bandwidth you actually have. And having too much bandwidth just means you're going to be paying more for no particular reason. Okay, so a lot of people will pay a lot for their broadband and get massive bandwidths when actually they just don't need it and just wasting their money. So there you go. So to summarize, bandwidth is the rate of data that we can send over a network at once. Okay, so measured in bits per second. If we have a low bandwidth, we're going to be waiting for downloads, we're going to be buffering, it's going to be slow, not because the data itself has gone slower, but I can't send much data at once. If I have a medium bandwidth, then I can send data much faster, not that it's traveling faster, but more data can be sent at once. And if I have a large bandwidth, the exact same thing happens. However, if I don't need that high bandwidth, then some of that bandwidth might be wasted and there's no need for it.
So we've just had a practical demonstration of bandwidth by a very handsome chap. I'm not sure who that guy is, but very handsome, very knowledgeable, very clever guy. Anyway, joking aside. Low bandwidth. Imagine we are trying to send this Netflix movie. If packets are being sent down a medium which has a low bandwidth, so we might be talking about your home broadband and you only have maybe 2 megabits per second or something along those lines, and you're trying to watch a 4K movie. Now, we can only send so much data down your broadband connection at once. Although Netflix can blast the movie to you really, really quickly, your connection to the internet, your bandwidth is small, so you can't receive all that data. So it's going to be kind of being held up effectively. So we're sending the data maybe one packet at a time. You can think of it that way. But we can only send a certain amount at once. So we have for all of those to go through. However, if I have a higher bandwidth, this starts to mean I can send more at once. So instead of maybe sending one packet, I can send two. So here you can see I'm sending two. So that is twice as fast. Now, although the packets were traveling at the same speed, because I can send two of them at once, I'm getting twice the amount of data at a single time. So as long as I'm sending lots of data at once, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so remember that high bandwidth. And again, we can send multiple packets. So it's really important not to confuse bandwidth and speed. Okay, a single packet will travel over your network at the same time. So going from one source computer to a destination computer, a single packet will travel the same distance, assuming it's traveling the same route, but that's another thing entirely. If I have a high bandwidth, the single packet will still take the same amount of time, but I might be able to send two packets at the same time, or 4 or 10, or however many packets we have room for. So it's the amount of data I can send at once. So let's see this example. So here I've got a low bandwidth and a high bandwidth. I'm only sending a small packet. Let's say it's a tiny email saying hi, so absolutely tiny amount of data being sent. Now the low bandwidth, the high bandwidth, we're going to perform exactly the same. Okay, so the packet is going to travel at the same speed. Okay, we can't control that speed, and most of the high bandwidth is being wasted. Okay, so I'm utilizing the low bandwidth really, really well, but the high bandwidth not so much. So now's the perfect time to stop and make some notes of bandwidth. Okay, so explain what we mean by bandwidth. This idea is the amount of data I can send per second, measured in bits per second. So explain how the bits per second for the network bandwidth below indicates how much data you can be sent and received over the network. So here we've got 54 to 150 megabits per second, which is standard Wi-Fi, and maybe fast Wi-Fi 900 megabits per second. So what difference does that actually really mean? So what's the difference between low bandwidth and high bandwidth? So make some good notes on that. Now, the next thing we need to consider is transmission media. Okay, so this is the second thing which makes an impact on performance. Now, the reason why transmission media makes a difference to performance is to do with the bandwidth on the one hand, and the second is to do with interference. Now, well, let's focus on one of those first. Let's think of bandwidth. Wired connections have a much higher bandwidth than wireless. Okay, much higher. Okay, so we can get 10 gigabytes, 100 gigabytes out of wired connections. Wireless, nowhere near that amount. Okay, even though wireless technologies are getting better, they're nowhere near wired. So if I want to send large amounts of data over my home network, I will need to have a wired connection to make sure it's better. It's going to be faster. So transmission media makes a big difference. The other reason why wireless can be slower is down to how wireless works. Okay, so we're going to cover these ideas later when we really go into wireless in more detail, but let's have a quick think about it. If I'm far away from my wireless access point, well, the signal is going to start to break down. Okay, I'm going to get a lower signal. I'm sure you've had situations where you've been at home, you're far away from your wireless access point, and your internet keeps dropping out, or your internet's really slow. And the reason for that is because wireless has a certain range, and if you go outside that range, you're not going to get the signal, and you're not going to get the same speed. So the closer you are to an access point, the faster the speed is going to be. Also, if there's anything in the way, so maybe a wall, door, window, whatever happens to be, physical objects will kind of start to interfere with the signal, which will start to slow that signal down. And also, if there's lots of wireless networks around you, so if you're maybe in a block of flats, for example, and everyone in the block of flats has their own Wi-Fi access point, those channels, again, we're going to cover this later, those channels will overlap with one another, and ergo will start to interfere with each other, and will slow your performance down. So wired is much faster, there's no interference, and it's more secure. Well, I say no interference, there's a tiny bit over the wires, but it's negligible. Obviously, it's much harder to set up because I'm going to have to physically wire the house or the building with physical wires, so we're not tripping over ourselves on it. And they're not portable. Devices that are wired can't be moved around easily. Wireless is much more portable. It's absolutely dead easy to set up. You put your wireless access point in, bang, you're done. And we can connect multiple devices without having to buy more cables, more switches, or anything like that. But it's much slower. Okay, the bandwidth is a lot smaller. We will get interference with obstructions, and obviously there's this issue with security that we can't secure it as much because people from outside the building can still pick up the wireless signal and potentially could hack it. So alongside the idea of wired and wireless, we also have the two different types of wired connections which we've already been introduced to. Copper cable has high bandwidth, but not as high as optical. We can probably push more through optical than we can. So copper cable uses electric signals to pass data between networks, and we'll have coaxial, unshielded, and shielded. So the shielded twisted pair are ideal for longer distances. They're also ideal for maybe going outside. If you're kind of doing a cable underneath the ground, you'd want to use a shielded twisted pair. Fibre optic gets a lot less interference, can go for much longer distances, can have a higher bandwidth, but obviously it's a lot more expensive. So it's really, really important that we, again, choose the right cable for the right job. So copper will be used for connecting computers as standard, whilst fibre optics tends to be used for connecting buildings. So the next thing to do in your notes is to make notes on the advantages and disadvantages of wired versus wireless. The exam really focuses on the difference there in performance, and they really need you to know the idea of why wireless is slower, has effectively a lower bandwidth than wired, and we are looking at that interference, the channels overlapping and things like that. I'll also explain why we have different transmission media. Now you may wish to, in your previous notes on transmission media, just add that into there. That's up to you. So the next thing to think about is latency. Now, latency is a bit of a strange thing because when we talk about lag in maybe in a game or something like that, we really are talking about latency. Now, latency is the time it takes a packet to go from you to the destination and back again. Okay. Now, the longer that takes for a packet to go from you to the destination and back again, the higher the latency. And in computer games, you might see your latency as measured in milliseconds, and I'm sure you know that if that number gets really big, you're going to start to see jumps in the game. It's not going to be responsive, and basically you're going to get owned, aren't you? So high latency is bad, low latency is good, which is the complete opposite of bandwidth. Okay, remember, high bandwidth, we send more data at once, good. Low bandwidth, can't send much data, bad. Latency, high bandwidth, high latency, takes longer for a packet to get to destination back in, bad. Boo. And low latency means it's going to take a short amount of time to come there and back again, means it's going to be more responsive, good, yay. Okay, you can see I've been stuck inside for too long. Anyway, now lag is the kind of layman's way of saying it, but latency is the correct term. Okay, it can be down to a number of reasons. Now, if you're using wireless, it could be down to interference. Why a lot of gamers will say no, it must never ever connect wirelessly to play computer games because you are not going to be able to respond as quickly. And it is generally true, unless you've got like super duper Wi-Fi. But even then, it's nowhere near as good as wired. Rain and other interference like walls and doors and all those other things I've talked about already can interfere with the wireless signals. the internet traffic load. Okay, so if the server is got a lot of people playing at the same time, for example, the number of users will massively impact the latency. So the more people using it at once, the longer it's going to take for the server to get to your request, to service your request, and ergo the higher latency, because it's going to take a longer time for that packet to come back, even though the network's actually not holding it back in that sense. The devices that you use to connect will make a difference. If you're using hubs, for example, not that anybody uses hubs anymore, if you were using a hub, that would actually make a difference as well. The longer the cable, because physically it's going to take longer to get through that cable, even though we're talking about a tiny amount, it does make a difference. And also, the longer the cable, the more the signal degrades, and again that can impact, because we're going to get more errors over a longer piece of cable. And as I already said, server load, the more users using a server, the slower that server is going to, or the longer, should I say, the longer that server is going to take to respond to your request. So, explain how the error rate and latency can affect performance. Now, there's a video here to watch, which I'll put into the notes and links for you, so you can use it. And again, I've already talked about it, but why is latency important for gaming, and why is bandwidth important for video streaming? And here's a bit of a twist on this. High bandwidth does not really make much difference for gaming, because we're never actually sending large amounts of data, but latency does make a big difference. On the flip side, latency doesn't really matter too much for downloading a video, but bandwidth makes a massive difference. Okay, so there's kind of two ideas we have to think about, and each of them impact different things in different ways. So actually having that understanding will help you understand those two terms much better. The last thing to really think about is users. Okay, and I've already kind of alluded to this already, but essentially, when we have a network, it is very common for lots of people using the network at the same time. So think of your home network. You might have your parents, your brothers and sisters using the network at the same time. You might have your PlayStation or Xbox downloading your updates. You're watching Netflix. Someone else is playing a game. You're all sharing the same bandwidth, the same broadband bandwidth, which means that you have a smaller part of that bandwidth just for yourself. If there was only one device using that bandwidth, you'd get all of the bandwidth. Every time you introduce a new user, you have a fraction of the available bandwidth just to yourself. And the same thing happens inside a school. So when you're inside a computer science lesson, for example, there might be 20 students in the class, and you're all sharing the same bandwidth to the file server. So if you're all downloading a large PowerPoint or a large video file to watch, you're going to see it go slowly, even though the broadband in a school is going to be much better than the one you'd have at home. So bandwidth is split between all users, meaning you're only going to get a fraction of that, and no matter how large that bandwidth is, the more users we add to the system, the more users using it concurrently at the same time, the slower the performance will be, always. So let's see this with our kind of little animation again. So imagine I've got 4 users, each of them wants to send data across the network. If we have a low bandwidth, then we can only send a little bit of data at once. So user 1 will send data, then user 2 will send data, and user 3 and 4 will just have to wait. So if I have a low bandwidth, then we can have these noticeable delays. Now in a school, if you probably have noticed this, where you've opened up a Word document and all of a sudden you wait and you wait, and you're waiting for maybe a minute, 2 minutes, sometimes even longer if the network is congested, and then all of a sudden it appears. And that's because you are physically waiting for your turn with the bandwidth. So if you have a higher bandwidth, user 4 ultimately will have less time to wait. So we can send more data at once, which means more users can use the bandwidth at the same time. So we have less waiting time for user 4 in this example, which means that the performances can be better. Okay, so to summarize, we have looked at the factors which impact performance of a network. We've looked at bandwidth, the amount of data we can send per second, not the speed of the network. We've looked at latency, the amount of time it takes a packet to go from your computer to the destination and back again. And the idea that high latency is bad, low latency good, high bandwidth is good, low bandwidth is bad. We looked at the idea of transmission media having an impact on performance. So wired is better than wireless due to a massive amount of interference and also low bandwidth. And we've also looked at the idea that the more users we have using a system, the higher the demand on the bandwidth is going to be. So ergo, the longer each user has to wait to be able to send and receive data.